The metal chair felt cold against Zixathala's broken exoskeleton as he sat in the small white room. His forearms were chained to the table in front of him, and his compound eyes kept moving around the room like he was looking for danger that might jump out at any moment. The lights above were too bright and hurt his eyes, but he could not look away from the alien sitting across from him. Investigator Mordan was a tall, gray creature with smooth skin and large black eyes that never seemed to blink. He wore the dark, blue uniform of the Galactic Council Investigation Unit, and his long fingers moved slowly as he set up a small recording device on the table between them. The device hummed softly as it came to life, and a small green light began to flash. "State your name and rank for the record," Mordan said in a voice that sounded like wind moving through dead leaves. Zixathala's mandibles clicked nervously before he spoke. His voice came out as a whisper even though he tried to sound strong. "Commander Zixathala of the Veltar Imperial Fleet. Serial designation 7749 Alpha. You commanded the heavy cruiser Dominion's Fist during the failed invasion of the Sol system," Mordan continued while looking at a datapad in his hands. "You were captured during the retreat from Earth orbit and have been held in medical custody. For 6 standard months while recovering from your injuries." The alien commander's whole body began to shake when Mordan mentioned Earth. His breathing became fast and shallow, and small clicking sounds came from his throat. "I don't want to talk about that place. I don't want to remember what they did to us." Mordan leaned forward slightly, and his black eyes seemed to grow larger. "The Galactic Council needs to understand what happened during the Terran conflict. Your fleet was the most powerful force ever assembled by the Veltar Empire. You had 300 ships and over 2 million soldiers. Yet you were defeated by a species that had barely learned to travel between stars. We need to know how this was possible." Zixathala closed his eyes and tried to calm his breathing. When he opened them again, they were filled with something that looked like terror mixed with confusion. "You don't understand. None of you understand. We thought it would be easy. We thought they were weak and primitive. We were so wrong." The investigator made notes on his pad as the alien commander spoke. "Tell me about your first contact with the humans. What were your initial observations?" "They called themselves humans, but we knew them only as the species from the 3rd planet of the Sol system," Zixathala began. His voice was getting stronger, but there was still fear in it. "Our scouts had been watching them for several cycles. They had only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and their ships were crude metal constructions held together with primitive welds and basic power systems." He paused and looked around the room again before continuing. "They had no energy shields, no plasma weapons, no bioarmor like civilized species use. Their bodies were small and soft with no natural defenses. No claws or fangs or poison glands. They seemed so fragile that we thought one of our warriors could defeat 10 of theirs without effort." Mordan nodded and continued taking notes. "What was the strategic assessment of their military capabilities?" "Laughable," Zixathala said with a sound that might have been bitter laughter. "Their largest warships were barely the size of our escort vessels. They used chemical propulsion for their missiles and projectile weapons that fired small metal slugs. Our intelligence estimated that our advance fleet alone could conquer their entire planet within a few solar cycles." The room fell silent for a moment except for the soft humming of the recording device. Mordan waited patiently while the alien commander seemed to gather his thoughts. When Zixathala spoke again, his voice was quieter and filled with something that sounded like wonder mixed with horror. "The Veltar Empire had conquered 47 worlds before we came to the Sol system," he said slowly. "Every species we encountered followed the same patterns. They would resist at first with their military forces, and when those were defeated, their governments would surrender to avoid civilian casualties. It was civilized warfare with rules and honor." His compound eyes focused on something far away, as if he was seeing memories that he wished he could forget. "We expected the humans to be no different. Perhaps they would put up a brief fight to save their pride and then accept our rule. We even prepared occupation protocols that would allow them to maintain their basic culture and governance under Veltar oversight. But that is not what happened," Mordan stated rather than asked. Zixathala's whole body shuddered, and he made a sound like broken glass being ground together. "No, that is not what happened at all. The humans did something that no other species had ever done. When we defeated their military forces, they did not surrender. When we destroyed their ships, they built more. When we killed their soldiers, more appeared to take their place. The alien commander leaned forward and his voice dropped to an urgent whisper. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that they seemed to enjoy it. Every battle we won seemed to make them fight harder. Every loss seemed to make them more dangerous. It was like they fed on conflict and grew stronger from their own pain. Morden stopped writing and looked directly at his prisoner. You are saying that the humans showed no fear of death? Fear? Zixthala laughed, but it was not a sound that held any humor. They embraced death like it was an old friend. They threw themselves at our forces with a joy that was terrifying to witness. We began to realize that we were not fighting a normal species that wanted to live and prosper. We were fighting something that had weaponized its own willingness to die. The investigator made more notes before asking his next question. When did you first understand that this would not be a typical conquest? The alien commander was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. During the first engagement at their moon. That was when we met Captain Jake Morrison and learned what the word human really meant. Investigator Morden watched as Zixathala's breathing became unsteady again at the mention of the human captain's name. The alien commander's 4 hands clenched into fists despite the chains that held them, and his compound eyes seemed to look through the walls of the interrogation room as if he was seeing that terrible day all over again. Tell me about Captain Morrison, Morden said softly while keeping his recording device focused on the prisoner. Zixathala's mandibles clicked rapidly before he could form words. Jake Morrison commanded a human frigate called the Denver. It was barely 200 meters long and built like a flying scrapyard with weapons bolted onto its hull, wherever they could find space. Our smallest escort vessel was 3 times its size. The alien commander paused and made that grinding glass sound. Again. We approached their moon base with Admiral Kethavar's flagship leading our formation. The Eternal Dominance was our greatest ship. A biocruiser grown in the spawning pools of our homeworld, and armed with plasma cannons that could crack a planet's crust. Behind it came 50 other vessels of the advance fleet. Morden continued, taking notes while Zixathala spoke. The prisoner's voice was growing stronger, but there was still that underlying tremor of fear that seemed to shake his whole body whenever he mentioned specific details about the humans. Their orbital defenses were pathetic, Zixathala continued. A few space stations made from welded metal plates and some missile platforms that looked like they had been built in a junkyard. We could have destroyed everything they had in orbit, within minutes if we had chosen to do so. The investigator looked up from his notes. Why did you not simply attack immediately? Admiral Kethavar was an honorable commander who followed proper military protocol. The prisoner replied. He ordered communications opened with the human forces and demanded their surrender according to galactic combat conventions. He even offered to spare their civilian population if they submitted peacefully. Zixthala's compound eyes focused on the table in front of him, and his voice became very quiet. Captain Morrison's response came through on all frequencies so every ship in both fleets could hear it. He spoke in clear galactic standard so there could be no misunderstanding of his words. What did he say? Morden asked. The alien commander's whole body began to shake again, and when he spoke his voice was filled with something that sounded like religious terror. He said, Unknown vessels, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Force. You are not welcome in our system. Turn around and leave now or we will kill every last one of you. Then he paused for a moment before adding, and we will enjoy doing it. Morden made notes about the human's response before asking his next question. How did Admiral Kethavar react to this threat? He laughed, Zixthala said with that broken glass sound. The entire bridge crew laughed. Here was a tiny ship barely large enough to carry 100 beings threatening a fleet that could reduce their entire world to ash. It seemed like the funniest thing any of us had ever heard. The prisoner's compound eyes began to move around the room again, as if he was looking for escape routes. Admiral Kethavar opened communications again and explained that the Veltar Empire was claiming their system for incorporation into our territory. He told Morrison that resistance was futile and would only result in unnecessary casualties. He gave them one final chance to surrender with dignity. And Captain Morrison's response to this final offer? Zixathala was quiet for a long moment, before answering. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Morrison said, Come and take it, and then cut communications. The next thing we saw was his frigate turning toward our flagship and accelerating at full power. Morden stopped writing and looked directly at his prisoner. "A single frigate attacked your entire fleet." "Not attacked," Zixthala corrected with horror in his voice. Morrison pointed his ship directly at the Eternal Dominance and pushed his engines past their safety limits. We could see on our sensors that his reactor core was building toward overload and his hull was starting to buckle from the stress. But he kept accelerating. The alien commander's breathing became rapid and shallow as he continued his account. Admiral Kethvar ordered our defensive weapons to destroy the approaching ship, but Morrison was flying an evasive pattern that our gunners could not track. His frigate was spinning and rolling and changing direction in ways that should have torn it apart from the gravitational forces. "Were you able to stop him?" "We hit his ship dozens of times," Zixthala replied while his compound eyes darted around the room. His hull was burning and atmosphere was venting from multiple breaches. Half his weapons were destroyed, and his engines were failing. Any sane being would have ejected in an escape pod or at least tried to minimize the damage to their vessel. The prisoner paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with that terrible wonder. But Morrison kept coming. Even when his ship was dying around him, he held course for our flagship. Even when his bridge was on fire and his crew was being killed by hull breaches, he never wavered from his attack run. Morden leaned forward with interest. "What happened when he reached your flagship?" Zixthala's whole body convulsed as if he had been struck by electricity. Morrison's frigate slammed into the Eternal Dominance's command spire at nearly half the speed of light. The impact vaporized both ships instantly, and the explosion took out 2 of our escort vessels that were flying in close formation. The investigator made detailed notes about this kamikaze attack before asking about the aftermath. "How did Admiral Kethvar survive if his ship was destroyed?" "He didn't," the prisoner replied in a voice that sounded dead. "Admiral Kethvar and his entire command staff were killed in the collision. Morrison's attack decapitated our fleet's leadership in the first 30 seconds of combat." The room fell silent except for the humming of the recording device. Morden waited while his prisoner seemed to struggle with the memories of what happened next. When Zixthala finally continued speaking, his voice had changed to something that sounded like a parent telling scary stories to children. That should have been the end of human resistance. They had sacrificed their best ship and their most experienced captain to destroy one of our vessels. But instead of being demoralized by the loss, the remaining human forces seemed to become more aggressive. What did they do next? Zixthala looked directly at his interrogator, and his compound eyes were wide with remembered terror. Captain Lisa Rodriguez commanded another human frigate called the Phoenix. While we were still trying to reorganize our formation after losing our flagship, she launched her ship directly at our main troop carrier. The alien commander's voice began to rise as he continued his account. "Rodriguez flew the same kind of suicide attack that Morrison had used, but when we tried to shoot her down, she did something that none of our tactical computers had predicted. She waited until our plasma beams were about to hit her ship, and then she detonated her reactor core manually." Morden stopped writing and stared at his prisoner. "She destroyed her own ship. The explosion created an expanding sphere of superheated plasma that our energy beams could not penetrate," Zixthala explained while his breathing became more labored. "Rodriguez used her ship's death as a shield to get close enough to ram our troop carrier. When the Phoenix hit the carrier, both ships were destroyed along with 15,000 of our finest soldiers." The investigator made more notes while trying to process what he was hearing. "So the humans were using their own vessels as weapons?" The prisoner nodded rapidly and his mandibles clicked in agitation. "But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what came next." Morden waited patiently as Zixthala struggled to continue his testimony. The alien commander's compound eyes were fixed on something that only he could see, and his breathing had become so irregular that the investigator wondered if medical attention might be needed. But after several minutes, the prisoner seemed to gather enough strength to continue speaking. "After losing 3 capital ships and our command structure, we pulled back to regroup," Zixthala said, in a voice that sounded hollow and distant. "Fleet Command decided that orbital bombardment was too risky, since the humans had proven they could damage our ships even with their primitive technology. Instead, we would conduct a ground invasion to secure key population centers." The investigator made notes while his prisoner spoke. "You landed troops on the Earth's surface?" "Yes." the alien commander replied with a shudder that ran through his entire body. I was given command of the ground forces for the North American continent since my ship had survived the orbital battle. We deployed 50,000 warriors to what human maps called the state of Colorado. Zixathala paused and his mandibles clicked nervously before he continued. The terrain was mountainous and difficult, but our forces were superior in every way that mattered. Our soldiers wore bioarmor that could stop any human weapon and carried plasma rifles that could melt through steel. Each warrior was worth 10 human soldiers in direct combat. Mordan looked up from his notes with interest. But the humans did not engage you in direct combat? The prisoner made that broken glass sound again, and his compound eyes began darting around the room. At first, they did exactly what we expected. Human military units tried to stop our advance using conventional tactics, and we destroyed them easily. Within the first week, we had eliminated most of their organized resistance and controlled all the major cities in our sector. So the invasion was proceeding successfully? Zixathala's whole body began to shake, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with terror. That was when we met Colonel Amy Patterson and learned that the humans had been planning for this kind of war long before we arrived. The investigator waited while his prisoner seemed to struggle with memories that obviously caused him great distress. When Zixathala finally continued, his voice was barely audible. Patterson was not a regular military officer. He said slowly, she was something the humans called a special forces commander who had been trained to fight enemies with superior technology and numbers. When the regular army was defeated, she took command of what remained and began a new kind of war. Morton made careful notes about this human leader. What made her tactics different from standard military doctrine? The alien commander's breathing became rapid and shallow as he replied. She understood that humans could not win battles against us using normal methods, so she stopped trying to win battles. Instead, she began trying to make us afraid to fight at all. How did she accomplish this? Zixathala was quiet for a long moment before answering. The first sign that something had changed came when one of our patrols found a group of wounded human soldiers in an abandoned village. Our medical protocols require that we treat enemy wounded according to galactic combat conventions, so we sent a rescue team to collect them. The prisoner's compound eyes focused on the table, and his voice became very quiet. The wounded humans were bait. Patterson had placed explosives under their bodies, and when our medical team tried to help them, the bombs detonated. 12 of our healers were killed instantly. Mordan stopped writing and stared at his prisoner. The humans used their own wounded
as weapons? That was only the beginning, Zixathala replied with horror in his voice. A few days later, Sergeant Kevin Murphy's unit was surrounded by our forces in a narrow mountain pass.
Instead of surrendering or fighting to the death, Murphy ordered his soldiers to trigger controlled avalanches that buried both human and Veltar troops under thousands of tons of rock. The investigator made detailed notes while trying to understand the implications of what he was hearing. The humans were willing to kill themselves to prevent capture? The alien commander nodded rapidly and his mandibles clicked in agitation. But Patterson was not content to simply make us afraid of taking prisoners. She began what the humans called psychological warfare, designed to break our will to fight. What form did this psychological warfare take? Zixathala's whole body convulsed as if he had been struck by lightning. She left recordings for our troops to find. Not propaganda trying to convince us to surrender, but detailed descriptions of what would happen to any Veltar soldier who was captured alive. The prisoner paused, and when he continued, his voice was filled with religious terror. Major Susan Clark broadcast messages on all frequencies describing human medical experiments that awaited prisoners. She explained how human scientists would study our biology by slowly dissecting us while we were still conscious. She promised that captured Veltar would be kept alive for months while humans learned how our organs functioned. Morton felt a chill run through his own body as he made notes about these psychological tactics. Were these threats genuine or merely intimidation? We never found out because none of our soldiers were ever captured alive after those broadcasts began, Zixathala replied in a dead voice. Warriors who had served the Empire for decades suddenly became terrified of being taken prisoner by creatures they had initially considered weak and primitive. The investigator waited while his prisoner seemed to gather strength to continue his testimony. When Zixathala spoke again, his voice had changed to something that sounded like a parent warning children about monsters. But the worst was yet to come. he said slowly. Dr. Peter Hayes was a human scientist who specialized in what they called agricultural chemistry. He studied the air samples we had left behind during our initial landing and discovered how to create poisons that specifically targeted Veltar biology. Chemical weapons? Morden asked while making urgent notes. The alien commander's compound eyes grew wide with remembered terror. Hayes developed compounds that attacked our respiratory systems in ways that caused maximum pain before death. When we breathed the poisoned air, our lungs would begin to dissolve from the inside while we remained conscious and aware of what was happening. Zixthala's breathing became labored as he continued his account. The humans began using these chemical weapons in areas where our troops were concentrated. Entire battalions would collapse, choking on their own blood and bodily fluids. The lucky ones died quickly, but most lingered for hours, while their bodies slowly destroyed themselves from within. The investigator stopped writing and looked directly at his prisoner. Your forces had no defense against these chemical attacks? Our bioarmor was designed to protect against energy weapons and projectiles, the prisoner replied with despair in his voice. It was never intended to filter out atmospheric toxins specifically designed to kill our species. Within days of Hayes beginning his chemical warfare campaign, we lost more soldiers to poison than we had lost in all our previous conquests combined. Morden made detailed notes about the human use of chemical weapons before asking about the overall impact on Veltar forces. How did your troops react to these new tactics? Zixthala was quiet for a long time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with something that sounded like broken faith. They became afraid. Warriors who had conquered worlds and faced death with honor began to panic at the sight of human resistance fighters. Soldiers who had served the Empire with pride started refusing orders to patrol areas where the chemical weapons might be present. The alien commander's whole body shuddered as he continued. Patterson had done something that no enemy in Veltar history had ever accomplished. She had made our forces afraid of the battlefield itself. Every breath of air might be poison. Every step might trigger an explosion. Every wounded enemy might be a trap waiting to kill anyone who showed mercy. So your ground invasion began to fail? The prisoner nodded and made that grinding glass sound. Worse than failure, we were forced to retreat to defensible positions and abandon most of the territory we had conquered. The humans had turned their entire world into a weapon designed to kill anyone who tried to occupy it. Morden continued taking notes while his prisoner seemed to sink deeper into his chair. What happened next? Zixthala looked directly at his interrogator, and his compound eyes were filled with the memory of horrors yet to come. We tried to make a final stand in one of their cities. That was when we learned that the word civilian has no meaning to the human species. The silence in the interrogation room stretched for several minutes as Zixthala seemed to struggle with memories that were almost too terrible to put into words. His compound eyes had stopped moving and were now fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls, as if he was seeing that final battle all over again. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. New Geneva was a human city in the mountains with about 2 million inhabitants. He began slowly. After our forces had been driven back by the chemical attacks and guerrilla warfare, we decided to make our final stand there. The city had good defensive positions and enough buildings to provide shelter for our remaining 50,000 troops. Investigator Morden made notes while watching his prisoner carefully. The alien commander's breathing had become very shallow, and his forehands were clenched so tightly that his exoskeleton was beginning to crack along the stress lines. We occupied the city center and established defensive perimeters around all the major approaches. Zixthala continued. Our engineers began converting human buildings into fortified positions, while our communications specialists tried to contact the fleet for evacuation support. We thought we could hold out until rescue arrived. The investigator looked up from his notes. How did the human forces respond to your occupation of their city? Zixthala made that broken glass sound, and his whole body began to shake. General Kate Williams commanded the human forces that surrounded us, but she did not attack our positions directly. Instead, she did something that violated every principle of civilized warfare that has existed since the formation of the galactic community. What did she do? The alien commander's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. Williams evacuated the children and elderly from the city but left all the adult civilians inside our defensive perimeter. Then she gave weapons and military training to every human who remained behind. Mordan stopped writing and stared at his prisoner. She armed the civilian population? Teachers, shopkeepers, office workers, mechanics, doctors, engineers. Zixthala listed while his mandibles clicked rapidly. Williams turned every adult human in the city into a soldier, and then used them to attack us from inside our own defensive lines. The investigator made urgent notes about this violation of combat conventions. Civilians are protected non-combatants under galactic law. Using them as soldiers is considered a war crime. The prisoner laughed, but it was not a sound that held any humor. Try explaining galactic law to a human kindergarten teacher who has learned to make explosive devices from cleaning supplies. Try telling a car mechanic that he is a non-combatant while he is converting farming equipment into weapons that can punch through bioarmor. Zixthala paused and his compound eyes began darting around the room again. Mr. Alex Turner taught small children during peacetime, but during the siege he used his school as a sniper nest. His classroom overlooked one of our main supply routes, and every day he would pick off our soldiers one by one with a hunting rifle that he had modified to fire armor-piercing rounds. The investigator continued taking notes while his prisoner described the urban warfare that had destroyed his forces. How did your troops respond to attacks from civilians? At first, we followed proper military protocol and tried to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, the alien commander replied. But Williams had made that impossible. Every human in the city was a potential enemy soldier. The woman serving food in the cafeteria might poison your meal. The man repairing your equipment might sabotage it to explode later. The doctor treating your wounds might inject you with toxins instead of medicine. Zixthala's breathing became more labored as he continued his account. Tony Garcia was a mechanic who worked on human transportation vehicles before the war. During the siege, he used his knowledge of engines and machinery to create improvised weapons from anything he could find. Farming tractors became armored fighting vehicles. Construction equipment became artillery pieces. Even children's toys were converted into explosive devices. The investigator made detailed notes about these improvised weapons. Were your forces able to adapt to this kind of urban warfare? The prisoner's whole body convulsed and he made sounds like he might be crying if his species was capable of tears. How do you fight an enemy when every building might contain soldiers and every civilian might be carrying a bomb? We were trained to battle other military forces using established tactics and clear rules of engagement. We had no experience fighting an entire population that had been turned into an army. Mordan waited while his prisoner seemed to gather strength to continue. When Zixthala spoke again, his voice was filled with something that sounded like religious despair. Captain Helen Ross was a human naval officer who coordinated the civilian resistance from inside our defensive perimeter. She used encrypted communications, hidden in children's video games, to send military intelligence to Williams's forces outside the city. The investigator looked up with interest. How did she manage to communicate without being detected? Our intelligence specialists intercepted thousands of human communications every day, Zixthala explained, while his mandibles clicked in agitation. But Ross had hidden her military messages inside entertainment programs that children used for games. We could see the communications traffic, but we could never determine which signals contained actual battle plans and which were just civilians playing games. The alien commander paused and his compound eyes focused on something far away. The siege lasted for months while our situation grew more desperate every day. We were surrounded by enemies that we could not identify until they attacked. We were being killed by weapons that had been built from household items. We were being poisoned by people who looked like harmless shopkeepers and teachers. When did you realize that the siege could not be sustained? Zixthala was quiet for a long moment before answering. When we discovered that the humans had been digging tunnels under our positions using mining equipment from construction sites around the city. Williams had been planning to collapse the entire city district from the very beginning of the siege. The investigator made urgent notes about this final tactic. The humans were willing to destroy their own city? The prisoner nodded and his voice became very quiet. Williams did not care about preserving human buildings or infrastructure. She only cared about eliminating our forces by any means necessary. While we were fighting her civilian soldiers on the surface, her engineers were placing explosives in the underground tunnels that would bring down every building in the city center. What happened when the explosives were detonated? Zixthala's whole body began to shake violently as he tried to describe what he had witnessed. The ground began to move like water, and buildings started collapsing into sinkholes that appeared without warning. Warriors who had survived battles on dozen worlds were crushed under tons of rubble along with the human civilians who had been fighting alongside them. The alien commander's breathing became rapid and shallow as he continued. But the worst part was not the destruction itself. The worst part was that Williams had calculated exactly how much explosive force would be needed to collapse our defensive positions while leaving escape routes for her own people. Most of the human civilians survived the controlled demolition, while almost all of our forces were trapped and killed. Morden stopped writing and looked directly at his prisoner. General Williams sacrificed her own city to eliminate your army? She sacrificed her city to win the war, Zixthala corrected, in a voice filled with terror and grudging respect. Williams understood that buildings could be rebuilt, but that defeating our invasion force was more important than preserving human infrastructure. She chose victory over preservation without any hesitation. The investigator made final notes about the siege before asking about the aftermath. How many of your forces survived the collapse of New Geneva? The prisoner was quiet for a very long time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded completely defeated. Less than 5,000 out of the original 50,000. Most of those were wounded and demoralized beyond any hope of continuing the fight. We were no longer a military force but merely a collection of traumatized survivors. And that was when your fleet decided to retreat from the Sol system? Zixthala made that grinding glass sound one more time, and his compound eyes filled with something that looked like anticipatory dread. No, that was when the humans showed us their final and most terrifying capability. They captured some of our technology and decided to bring the war to our homeworld. Investigator Morden looked at his prisoner with growing concern as Zixthala seemed to sink even deeper into his chair. The alien commander's compound eyes had become completely unfocused, and his breathing was so shallow that the recording device was barely picking up his voice. But when the investigator started to call for medical assistance, Zixthala suddenly looked directly at him with an expression of absolute terror. You have to understand what they did next, the prisoner said in a voice that sounded like someone confessing their worst sins. The humans did not simply defend their world and drive us away. They followed us home and showed us what it means to face an enemy that has nothing left to lose. Morden made notes while watching his prisoner carefully. Tell me about the human counterattack. Zixthala's mandibles clicked rapidly before he could form words. While our surviving forces were trying to evacuate from Earth orbit, the humans were already studying the wreckage of our destroyed ships. Engineer Rachel Stone and physicist Dr. Carl Bennett led teams of human scientists who reverse-engineered our technology in a matter of weeks. The investigator looked up from his notes with surprise. Weeks? Most advanced species require years to understand alien technology. That is what we thought too, the prisoner replied with that broken glass sound. But humans learn differently than other species. They do not simply copy technology that they find. They study it until they understand how it works, and then they improve it to make it more effective for their purposes. Zixthala paused and his compound eyes began darting around the room again. Stone's engineering teams modified our plasma weapons to fire faster and hit harder than the original designs. Bennett's physicists improved our faster-than-light engines to travel at speeds that our own ships could not match. Within a month, the humans had built a strike force that was more advanced than anything in the Veltar fleet. Morden made urgent notes about human technological adaptation. How large was this strike force? Only 12 ships, the alien commander replied. But each vessel was a hybrid of human engineering and captured Veltar technology. They combined our advanced systems with human tactical thinking in ways that created something entirely new and terrifying. The investigator waited while his prisoner seemed to struggle with memories that were obviously causing him great distress. When Zixthala finally continued, his voice was barely audible. Commander Mary Chen led the human strike force on their first interstellar attack against our territory, he said slowly. But instead of targeting military installations or fleet bases like a normal enemy would do, Chen chose to attack civilian infrastructure on our colonies. The humans attacked non-combatant populations? Zixthala's whole body began to shake as he replied. Chen's forces struck the orbital power stations that provided energy to 3 of our core worlds. Without power, the planetary food distribution systems failed and the atmospheric processors that maintained breathable air began shutting down. Billions of Veltar civilians faced starvation and suffocation. The investigator made detailed notes about these attacks on civilian targets. This was clearly a violation of galactic combat conventions. The prisoner laughed, but it was a sound filled with hysteria rather than humor. Try explaining combat conventions to a species that uses kindergarten teachers as snipers and turns shopping malls into bomb factories. The humans had already shown us that they recognize no distinction between soldiers and civilians, so why would they respect that distinction when attacking our worlds? Mordan continued writing while his prisoner described the escalating human offensive. What was the response from Veltar High Command? Panic, Zixthala replied without hesitation. Our military leaders had never faced an enemy that was willing to target civilian populations as a primary strategy. We had ships and weapons to fight other armies, but no defense against opponents who ignored all the rules of civilized warfare. The alien commander's breathing became more labored as he continued his testimony. The human attacks continued for several more weeks, with Chen's forces striking infrastructure targets throughout our territory. Water treatment facilities, communication networks, transportation hubs, medical centers, everything that our civilian population needed to survive became a target for human weapons. Did the Veltar fleet attempt to stop these attacks? Zixthala made that grinding glass sound, and his compound eyes filled with remembered shame. Our warships tried to intercept Chen's strike force, but the humans had learned to fight space battles the same way they fought ground battles. They used tactics that no military academy in the galaxy had ever taught. The investigator looked up with interest. What made their space combat tactics so different? Chen's ships would appear in a system and immediately target the most valuable civilian installations rather than engaging our military forces, the prisoner explained. When our warships moved to protect the civilians, the humans would retreat at faster than light speeds before we could catch them. Then they would appear in a different system and repeat the same attack pattern. Morden made notes about these hit-and-run tactics. So the humans were using your concern for civilian casualties as a weakness to exploit? Exactly, Zixthala replied with terror in his voice. They understood that we would always prioritize protecting non-combatants over military objectives, so they made every engagement a choice between pursuing their military forces and saving innocent lives. And they knew we would choose to save lives every time. The alien commander paused, and when he continued, his voice had changed to something that sounded like a broken prayer. But the worst was yet to come. Admiral Steve Parker took command of the human interstellar fleet and delivered an ultimatum that no species in galactic history had ever dared to make. What were the terms of this ultimatum? Zixthala's whole body convulsed as if he had been struck by lightning. Parker did not demand our surrender or offer to negotiate a peace treaty. He demanded the complete withdrawal of all Veltar forces from a 50-light-year radius around Earth, along with technological tribute and reparations for the damage we had caused during our invasion. The investigator stopped writing and stared at his prisoner. The humans were demanding tribute from the Veltar Empire? But that was not the terrifying part. The prisoner continued in a voice filled with religious dread. The terrifying part was that Parker proved the humans had the capability to destroy our entire civilization if we refused to meet their demands. Morden leaned forward with urgent interest. How did they demonstrate this capability? Zixthala was quiet for a long moment before answering. Parker's fleet appeared in our home system and easily destroyed the orbital defenses that were supposed to protect our capital world. Then, instead of attacking the planet directly, they simply waited in orbit while broadcasting a message to our government. The alien commander's compound eyes focused on something far away as he continued. Parker explained that his ships carried enough human-modified plasma weapons to sterilize the entire surface of our homeworld. He gave our leaders exactly 1 hour to accept the human terms or watch their entire species become extinct, and the Veltar government agreed to these demands. The prisoner nodded and his voice became completely defeated. High Command had no choice. We had seen what humans were capable of doing to their enemies. We had watched them sacrifice their own cities and turn their entire population into weapons. We knew that Parker was not making an empty threat. Mordan made final notes about the human ultimatum before asking his last question. In your assessment, why were the humans so successful against a technologically superior enemy? Zixathala was quiet for a very long time before he answered. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with something that sounded like terrible enlightenment. Every other species in the galaxy fights wars to achieve specific political or economic objectives, he said slowly. We conquer worlds to expand our territory or access their resources. We battle other fleets to demonstrate our military superiority. Even when we kill our enemies, it is to accomplish some greater strategic goal. The alien commander looked directly at his interrogator, and his compound eyes were wide with remembered horror. But humans are different. They do not fight wars to achieve objectives. They fight wars to completely destroy anyone who threatens them. Every tactic they used, every weapon they built, every sacrifice they made had only one purpose: to ensure that their enemies could never threaten them again. Mordan continued, taking notes while his prisoner delivered his final assessment. So you believe the humans won because they were more ruthless than your forces? No, Zixathala replied with absolute certainty. They won because they enjoyed every brutal tactic, every impossible victory, every moment when they should have broken from despair. They celebrated like it was the greatest achievement of their species. The alien commander's voice dropped to a whisper that was barely picked up by the recording device. I saw Captain Morrison smile just before his ship collided with our flagship. I heard General Williams laughing as she detonated the explosives that collapsed New Geneva. I watched Admiral Parker's face when he delivered the ultimatum that brought the Veltar Empire to its knees.